Hello, everyone. Welcome to the IPython weekly developer lab meeting for Thursday, June 12th. And, we've got a couple things on our agenda this morning. So I guess the first issue that's on the agenda is 5371. So this is a pull request that Min submitted a while back. And so Mathjax can either be configured to center or left justify all equations globally.
Mm-hmm.
And as I understand it, our global configuration before and after this pull request is, what is it, left? It's center justify, right?
Yeah.
And the only place that we use left justification is in LaTeX output.
Mm-hmm.
And there, all other output is left justified. So previously we were using CSS to do that.
And it doesn't work.
And it doesn't work. This makes basically a call to mathjax.hub.config before and after the call to the type setting.
Mm-hmm. That
changes that configuration option in Mathjax. It works fine. The difficulty is that this approach won't work on NBConvert or NBViewer, because there we just call Mathjax a single time to render the entire page. Is that an accurate statement, then?
Yes, although, so Mathjax can take elements and/or a query.
Mm-hmm.
So we could run Mathjax two times.
Okay. Basically.
So one thing I don't know if Mathjax can take like a jQuery array. That would be required for it to take an array of elements rather than a single DOM element. I don't know that that's the case. That would be a requirement to call it 2 times instead of n times.
Yeah. I guess I think that's the most sensible thing that I've thought of, or I mean, I didn't think of it, or that I've heard about this issue.
Mm-hmm.
I think it would be nice to have the left justified equation. I mean, the only other option is to basically say we center equations everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, it wouldn't bug me too much to say it is a limitation of Mathjax, that it really doesn't like to have multiple configurations on one page, and try to ask Mathjax for a feature to say, when rendering this equation, can you center it? Or can you left justify it explicitly on an equation basis?
Yeah.
Because I don't think there's a technical limitation. It's just there isn't an API for it.
Right. No, obviously that's.
I'll look and see if we can get NBConvert to work with left justify.
Okay.
With 2 calls.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think the nicest way of doing it would be for Mathjax to build an API that looked for a class on a container.
Yeah.
And if that class is present, it would center or left justify. Basically, put it back in the land of CSS.
Mm-hmm.
So that you don't have to sort of call Mathjax, micromanage all the Mathjax calls and all the different elements for this purpose. But
right.
But yeah, no, if you can give like a CSS selector.
I would do a data attributes, because CSS selector, you might think that adding the selector after it has been rendered would change it. But I think it's a detailed implementation.
Yeah, no, no, data attributes, selectors, something like that.
Yes. Okay. getting rid of parent app name. This is kind of a pollution of, it's one place where we violate our own assumptions about what the kernel knows about its parent.
We can... Pandas is the only thing I'm aware of that uses it, and it uses it to avoid displaying HTML tables in the Qt console, which no longer happens because we've said that the Qt console can't display HTML.
Right.
So at some point we can ask them to remove that hack. I don't know how long they'll want to wait before, because it's only, is it in IPython 2? Did they change to the Qt console? No, I think that's since 2. I think that's only in Python development directions at the moment, but the Qt console doesn't try to display HTML.
Yeah.
So I think it's fine with us making the change in my mind. It's mainly a question of how do we manage this with pandas, right?
Worse in worse, again, Evan checks the IPython version before doing something. If they already check the app name, say, hey, if we don't have the correct app name, we also check the IPython version, and they can have a smoother transition if really needed.
Yes, we just need, well, assuming that we don't want to break pandas, we need to get a change into pandas before we can do this.
If you remove it, Panda will still works. It doesn't technically break pandas. If you remove the app name,
How does pandas do the check?
Do
they check for the Qt console or do they check for the notebook?
They check for both. They basically have two functions. One is like it is IPython, and the other one is Qt console, and both of those functions call. Look at the parent app name.
All right. Well, we can look at how they do it and see what we can do. I should have made it more public that pushing it to 3, in my mind, meant that it was deprecated in 2, but we didn't make that information. So, in my mind, okay. Because this was proposed, the only reason it wasn't merged in 2 is because this would break an existing thing, so we need a deprecation cycle. So, to my mind, that meant that in 2.0, parent app name is deprecated.
Yes, okay. Deprecation works with the whole documentation thing, not in Min's mind.
I know. But it's just like, it's some super obscure private API that it's honestly not the kind of thing I feel bad breaking.
Yeah, I'm leaning in that direction, I think.
But yeah, let's make sure we understand what Panda's doing and be clear.
Yeah, I mean, so is the action item for us to maybe open an issue on Pandas that brings
and
up?
Figure out. Yeah, I looked for some Qt console stuff and didn't actually find anything, but
I found the relevant bits of code.
Okay, because if they're only checking for the Qt console,
there's in the IPMB check as well.
Okay,
what that's doing.
Yeah, but that we have. It is. I mean, we can potentially reconsider this, and we could say maybe parent app name is something we should keep, and relax the notion that the kernel can't know, because it really is it really is artificial that the kernel doesn't know that it's in the notebook. It doesn't know that the calling front end is the notebook. That's also artificial. There's no reason that we couldn't add to execute requests, hey, I'm a notebook. At the same time, it's totally artificial that the kernel doesn't know who started it, because in fact the kernel does know exactly who started it with his parent app name. So I see there's kind of two options. One, that it's kind of it's a bug that they can figure out what the front end is. And I just have, because we've always said the kernel cannot know who the front end is.
Yeah, and
so
I
if you can guess, the fact that your guess might guess wrong across IPython versions.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important for us to at least continue to proclaim that as the official message, that kernels should not ever know what front end is running. But it's obviously a leaky abstraction. I mean, you can find out that information in a number of different ways.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's possible.
But at the same time, the use case that Pandas is using it for is something that we have now actually fixed, which is that the HTML representation in the Qt console was worse than the text representation.
Yeah. Yeah, so they should stop doing what they're doing as of IPython 2. Right.
Did we get around to turning HTML representations off for 2?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'll have to check, but I think so.
I thought that was more recent than 2.
Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, we should figure out when we did what we did.
Yeah. So sounds like we just need to open an issue to start to talk this over with them and see what they find acceptable.
Yeah.
And honestly, I would. Well, actually, this is important. So the other way of finding out what front end is running is to publish JavaScript that sends that information back. Although if we end up doing iframes, that approach could go away.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think they.
And you always have this way of running the notebook headless, and you are actually rerunning a notebook to see it as a notebook. But basically, publishing JavaScript will not work.
Yeah, so like if you run it with the nbconvert execute preprocessor or run IPNV, things like this will be wrong.
Yes.
And we will also move toward having, like, I suppose, MVC with model and controller on the server side to have persistence and notebooks that continue publishing when you close your browser window, and then when you publish JavaScript, it will not work. So we cannot go this way.
Yeah. No. Absolutely. No. I think. And I mean, obviously, something like. The JavaScript approach definitely won't work on Google Drive, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I understand. I think the right answer for Pandas might be to make the configuration of these things easier and allow users to explicitly choose.
Well, yeah, but what they do is actually redundant because there is a Pandas option.
Yeah.
But what it does is check, is the option set and am I in the notebook and is the option set rather than just is the option set. And
they get this variable and then this IPNVH variable is not actually used anywhere.
Oh, it's not? Okay, so maybe they don't actually need to do anything.
They do still check in the Qt console.
Yeah, so there may not actually be anything they need to do because.
Can you post a link to the relevant part of Pandas?
Yes. So there's one.
Okay.
There's
Killing the pager.
Yeah.
Replace with what?
So
Correct.
I mean, there's a couple parts of this. So I've got a pull. Well, I guess I haven't submitted a pull request. I've got a branch where I've removed the pager from the UI, and for the most part, that's pretty simple. There's one part of the HTML templates I want to discuss about that, but then I guess the other question is what do we replace it by, and how do we do that? Is this something we want to try to do for 3.0?
So we talked for a while about having a way that you could kind of pop the output area out from the document and have it floating around, possibly dockable.
Yeah, basically let the output area behave a bit more like the widget area.
I think that's...
Can the widget area be popped out?
Or widgets can.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fairly reasonable thing to think about.
And then just kill the entire notion of a pager. In the notebook, anyway.
Yeah. No, I mean, I guess I would be fine with us getting rid of the pager UI in the notebook.
Then we need a shortcut to pop out
No,
the output.
I think I would be fine for 3.0 if we got rid of it, and then in the notebook, output just the pager is output, and we don't yet have a pop out. I mean, I feel like adding the pop out capability is something we can. I would be fine living
I
with.
think the floating windows is super useful when you read documentation. I mean, it would impair me a lot not to have the pager, not to have documentation, static documentation of function I can read through and having my code above. It really forces you to scroll with the mouse and go up and down, and I mean, I would prefer to have the pop-up thing work.
No, I think it's good to have the pop-up thing. I guess my feeling is that the problems that the pager creates are so bad that it's worth living with a little less functionality for a while we fix those things.
I mean,
when you say they're so bad, we've lived with them for several versions of IPython. They can't be that terrible.
I've actually had the pager disabled for a number of months.
No,
it hasn't, but
because it is so bad.
Yeah,
users in general have.
Yeah.
And I'm basically where, and the thing that I've noticed.
Yeah, and I've actually had several people who have requested can I just get rid of the pager because it doesn't do what I want. So yeah.
Yeah. No, and I mean what I've been noticing is that the situations where I want to use the pager, it almost always works better to just have it as output. Now, I mean, the only situation where that I start to feel maybe a little differently is if, the only situation is something I don't do, and that is if I have a really, really long code cell that I'm writing, and I'm working at the top of it, and the pager output is in the following cell, then there's a lot of scrolling involved. But as a matter of practice, I pretty much don't write long cells. And so it's always the case that the cell I'm working on and a previous or next cell with pager output would always be visible at the same time.
I mean, you probably have big screens. I mean, if you're working on a small laptop, I mean, if you think as a developer right now, if we kill the pager now, we know that basically we will live maybe 6 months without pager. But for some people that will upgrade, they will maybe upgrade the next version, but they might not upgrade for maybe 10 more months or 12 more months. It means that they will live a full year without pager, and they have no way to get it back. In my opinion, if we get rid of the pager, we should at the same time remove it and have it pop out. I mean, John did the popping out of widget. Maybe he can tell us how much difficult it would be to make an output area.
Well, I don't think that part of it's going to be hard, but I think what has to go along with that is a complete reconsideration of the output area UI in terms of collapsing, scrolling. Like I don't think we should just hack popping out into the current output area UI. I think that's. I mean, in my mind,
maybe we should do this the other way around. Then maybe we should work on the output area UI, and once that's ready, then take the pager out.
Yeah, that's probably the least. That's probably the least disruptive way to do it.
Yeah, no, actually, I think that's a.
As I said, people like me aren't bothered because I effectively don't have a page.
Right.
So it's fine, however horrible it is, because I will never use it because it's too horrible.
Okay. No, I mean, I think that's fairly reasonable. Yeah.
Let's look at kind of cleaning up output area UI, including in that notion popping it out. And once we have the ability to pop out output, then putting the pager as regular output becomes like you don't lose much, or you don't really lose anything. Yeah.
Okay. No, I think that's. I've got a pull request where I started some of the output area UI, and so I can. I'll pick away at that instead of picking away at the pager stuff.
Makes sense.
Require JS stuff?
Yeah.
So that's been coming along well. I did pretty much everything but the notebook.html, which I put off to the very end. And the beginning was really easy. Like doing the rest of the notebook was really easy because there wasn't that much to do. But once I hit main.js and notebook.js, I really started to slow down. And there's a lot of places in main.js, for example, where we load things that really aren't necessary to load until later. Like I think, like marked, for example, we could make that a dependency of the cell and things like that. So I've been trying to figure out where these different things go. I opened a PR just so you guys could look and see what I've been up to, but just fair warning, there is a bunch of code snippets kind of sitting all over the place in files, things that I haven't really found a good home for yet that I'm going to try to find a good home for in the future. But when you guys do look at that, that's one thing that we'll want to think about seriously is the stuff, like what stuff I'm loading in main.js that I could move to a lower location, what stuff in Notebook I could move to a lower location, and, just like where things are being loaded. Yeah,
it's kind of drawing the dependency graph, because there probably actually shouldn't be that many things in main.
Exactly. But one problem I've had with that, like one reason I haven't been able to move a lot of things out, is it seems like we have components that we load that actually populate the DOM when we load them, and like they're not in our templates. So things that you would think, trying to think of a good example, things that you would think you wouldn't need to load there, you still have to load there because it draws the element on the page, even if it's not functionally doing anything other than
I don't
rendering
think
that
anything
element.
draws on the page when you load it.
Oh, it does it? Like loading the pager and loading...
No,
You instantiate the pager.
but that usually
But instantiating the pager still happens in main.
Yes,
Yeah.
which I've left there and haven't moved
But
down.
loading the
because of
pager
that.
doesn't.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. No,
But
Sorry, I
like,
should have been more
I think
clear.
most of the dependencies are going to be. So look, instantiating stuff, the body of main shouldn't change much.
Mhm.
But its requirements should really only be its immediate requirements.
yes, it shouldn't be everything.
So it's going to be like, and I don't. We may need to be a bit fiddly about some of these things. Like, it's mainly going to require a notebook. Notebook requires all the cells. It requires widgets. It requires the kernel.
But I do think the main and part of what, so I think the page, like if you think in terms of the top level entity, that would be the page, and the page would require like the toolbar and the menu bar and the notebook, and then the notebook would require its children. But yeah, so John, do you want to summarize? I think one important aspect is how you're doing the main IPython namespace.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's another thing. So there's a lot of places where we abuse that right now. You want me to? You want to go?
Well, let me give a little bit of background, and that's that if we get rid of the IPython global namespace entirely, that means that no JavaScript can run in the global namespace. Basically, like if you want to do keyboard shortcuts in your custom JS, you have to require the right things. And so there's a question of, one, do we want to try to maintain IPython, the global namespace? That's what John is doing currently, right? You have a backwards compatibility-ish thing?
Yeah.
So why don't you talk about how you're doing that, and then we can sort of decide if that's a direction we want to do.
Yeah, so right now in our code base, we have a lot of places where we abuse the IPython namespace, and like we'll put instances in it, and then in other files we will reference those instances via the global namespace instead of passing those instances, trickling those instances down where they're needed. So that's another thing that I've been doing is trying to make sure that the only things that are being required in are namespaces, not instances. And so the way I have it set up is if, let me just think of an example. I guess the notebook would be a good example. So in main.js, I require the notebook JS. That loads the notebook namespace into main.js, and then I create an instance of that notebook object in main, and then store the instance in the IPython namespace for backwards compatibility for scripts. And then inside notebook.js, at the bottom of notebook.js, right before it returns its own namespace, its class type, it stores the class type in the IPython backwards compatibility namespace. So modules themselves put their class types in the namespace, and then places where the things are instantiated also put them in the IPython namespace.
Nothing's instantiated. So it's only ever main where anything gets put on the IPython namespace, where instances get put on the namespace, right?
Wait, repeat again. Sorry.
No modules other than main create instances and then attach those instances to IPython.
Yes. Exactly. No.
Yeah, everyone.
Then, if it's not the case, then the module should return something, and main should take care of attaching it to the main IPython namespace.
Yeah, no, right now I haven't been doing it like that. But if I do it like that, should the main JS file traverse into the objects and then put those in the namespace that way, or should the object instances also be returned along with the namespace in require? Because right now in require, I've only been returning a single namespace, like consistently everywhere.
So I think one way to think about this is to map it onto how we build things in Python. And I guess the way that I view it is that all the require stuff is like all of the imports that happen in an IPython application when it's starting, right? You know, the main application object imports shell, and shell imports all of its children, and the instances are built by basically triggering the instantiation of the main object for that application, right?
Yeah.
And there's two different ways that those instances are accessed. One is that parents store their children instances, and I think, John, you're saying previously we weren't doing that, and now you are, right? That parent JavaScript objects store their instances rather than accessing them.
Previously, we would just put them in the global space.
Okay, so that I think that pattern makes a lot of sense. The other question is how does external code access the instances? And our model in IPython is that we have this get IPython function call that returns some object that has handles on all the instances. In that case, it's the interactive shell object. And I think the question is what is that equivalent API in JavaScript? Is it the global namespace, or is it something that users can require that has all the instances?
Man, putting require on in every JavaScript output would be a nightmare.
Require should never be used to get instances. Require is made to import, and you almost except for Singleton, you never use require for instances.
Yeah.
So each object in JavaScript, instance of objects that create another object that needs to be accessed to, should have a properties that expose this object.
But that can't. So I don't think. And here's the challenge, and that is that we need to build something with require that would allow someone else to reuse our JavaScript code and all of our require infrastructure, but instantiate completely different objects.
Sure, but when you use an object that can quack and walk, and then you call it it's from class duck, you have a lowercase duck attribute on your object, and it's behaving normally.
No, I think that's fine. But for example, I don't think the objects returned by require should contain instances.
Right, that's what Matthias is saying.
That's what you guys are both agreeing.
Great. Okay, that I think would.
Yeah, so you would never use require to get an instance.
Okay, great.
Yes, which is what I'm doing right now. This is
So
all
the
what
question is, what do you do to get an instance, and what is the object that contains all our instances? And it sounds like we need an analog of interactive shell, whether it's just whether we call it, app or whatever page. Who cares? But IPython, we can call it lowercase IPython. I don't think it, but I think there is a top level thing that we're using the IPython name for that I think should exist. It just shouldn't be the same as the module name. Right?
So
Does that make sense?
Got it.
Yeah, is that maybe, I mean, right now our top level object, right, is page.
Uh-huh.
John, do you think there's a, like the hierarchy of page, which requires menu bar and toolbar and notebook, and then somewhere we could have an I don't.
Well, from what I've been looking at, pages load it alongside notebook, menu bar, and toolbar, and then those are passed. And page is used in multiple places, so not just on notebook.
I think the top level thing actually doesn't exist.
It just, it doesn't exist right now.
I think
because, like, with what I've been doing, I must have a bad connection or something. I see you guys talking, but I don't hear anything. What I've been dealing with right now, there are two separate apps. So there's like a main tree file that requires all the different tree source, and then a main one for the notebook stuff. So there definitely isn't.
There's main on login, and there's a main for every page.
So actually, why don't, maybe it would be helpful, John. I mean, you could just do this on the whiteboard in that room and maybe take a picture. Why don't you draw like the main parts of the object hierarchies for our 2 pages, and so we can, use that to think through. Okay, what top level object do we need? Instance of some class do we need that would contain all the children instances? And I think part of what I am imagining is the case now is that unlike the Python code where there's a single instance hierarchy, I think in JavaScript we probably have multiple separate disjoint instance hierarchies that, like, I don't think there's any links from the page object, the page instance, to the notebook instance. Like, I think they're completely separate.
Right, but if we just, so in Python we have a get IPython that returns a single thing that has a handle on everything.
Yep.
I think in JavaScript we could call it get IPython, whatever. That returns a single thing that has a handle on everything. And that can be, at this point, right, so right now we attach a bunch of instances to IPython.
Yes.
We could just do, lowercase IPython equals object literal, and then do it all the same, but with this object rather than the namespace object.
Yes, and I think absolutely. I think the important thing, though, in this case is that the top level object, in some ways, is a higher level thing in that it needs to include things like the menu bar and the toolbar and the pager and the keyboard manager, and yes, but yeah,
well, here's an idea. I mean, for what I'm using the IPython global namespace now, I could just remove the types from it, and then it would function just like that. So then the IPython global namespace, I mean, we could change it to lowercase IPY, and it would just have instances in it. Because or would I only store the handle to the topmost things that I need? So page, notebook, menu bar, and toolbar, and then those would have properties that would have the instance. Okay.
Yes. No. There should. Yeah. The least in the instance hierarchy should not also be at the top level.
Okay. Got it.
Although we did find that I can't remember when we added sessions and everything with the kernel. We found that getting access to the kernel by doing ipython.notebook.session.kernel every time is incredibly tedious. So there absolutely are going to be things for which it is worth having one instance have 2 entries, because it's so frequently used.
For those cases, we could just use require the load that pool namespace in and just populate it in that, wherever
Yeah, but
that's
require won't
instantiated,
get
right?
you instances.
Yeah.
Oh,
That doesn't.
that doesn't work.
In Python, when you have deep things like that, you can use intermediate variables or do from import. You can do the same in JavaScript. I mean, I don't think it's that awful to get.
No, it's not the class. It's the instance.
Yeah,
Getting the class is not a problem. It's just the instance.
Yep.
And I just mean that I wouldn't move things. Well, maybe some things, but this is already. We have already moved the kernel down further in the hierarchy and realized that was wrong. That we did that. When we did that, we shouldn't have, and moved it back. Or copied it back.
What does create a kernel? What is the hierarchy for the kernel already?
The notebook creates a session.
Yep.
The session creates a kernel.
And then when that's done, we just hardwire notebook.kernel to be that kernel, so it's simpler to get to. I think things like that are fine.
Yeah.
But that's different from making kernel a top-level object.
It's only
For
really a
example.
difference of degree, though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, I wouldn't necessarily in this process change what level at which things are defined. Things are accessible. Because some of those things have been thought about.
Yeah.
Anyway, okay.
Yeah, we may want to just use the current IPython namespace as that global object. Otherwise, we will break everyone's JavaScript code. And
In that JavaScript, it's already broken.
What do you mean?
No, it was a joke. It's JavaScript. In JavaScript, it's broken. Whatever.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
I got it, Matthias.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you.
Yeah, and we'll have to look at what our JavaScript looks like because we've also got like the model splitting stuff that who knows when we'll get to. But
yeah, well, that's a separate issue I'll bring up after we're done with this. But okay, anything else related to this, or is that?
No. Well, I'll go ahead and try to do what we talked about. Before we depart the subject, though, so am I just going to use a global variable then to store that, not require it whatsoever, just for now, for those top-level instances?
So are you asking whether or not you should remove the namespace require inclusions?
Yes, and I think the answer is yes to that, and then just use a no.
You mean remove IPython? Remove the idea of IPython.util? Is that the question you're asking?
No, remove the backwards compatibility capital IP IPython.
Modules should not define that in themselves. I mean,
okay,
no
then I'll
module
just
require IPython. Everything should be bound to IPython in main.js.
Got it. All right, I will remove that then, or move it to there for now and then fill it later.
Okay.
Sounds good.
So I'm working on reviewing the contents web service min, and I mean overall it's great. I'm just slowly compiling comments, and I will.
I think there are a bunch of notebook things that stuck through in the big that I haven't found and replaced.
One question for discussion is, and I'll post a comment on this, but I think it's worth talking about. Right now, we sort the notebook or the content list in two places. The manager class sorts it by name only, and then the handlers sort it basically do a group by operation where there's directories separate from notebooks and files. And there's, I think, two questions. One, do we want to move all the sorting to one location? And the other is, do we want to group by files and notebooks separately as well? Right now they're interleaved.
Yeah, I actually talked to Thomas about it. I think we shouldn't group notebooks and files. I think Thomas thinks we should.
Yeah.
I think that kind of, so we want to add, sort by modified and stuff to the dashboard.
And sort by type is
sort by kind is what that would be.
Yeah.
And so I'm kind of the opinion that if the default view is sort by kind, that's fine. But I think that it should be the JavaScript that does the sorting. But I don't know. I mean, I could, if people feel strongly about grouping files and notebooks separately, that's fine. I am slightly inclined that I think that's not a good idea, but I don't feel that strongly.
So maybe that would indicate that we should move the group by sorting that is currently in handlers, move that to the JavaScript.
Ultimately, yes, but I don't want to do that in this thing.
Okay. So
yeah, because there's the redo the whole dashboard thing with the adding date modified and everything.
Right.
That should have sort by various columns.
Yep.
The only downside of doing it just separating notebooks just with sort by is that unless you build a really advanced sort by interface, like more advanced than most file managers, you can't see notebooks sorted by name, because if you sort by name, then your notebook's going to be spread out among all your other files.
What do you mean? When you do a sort, you do sort like it does a hierarchical sort in an order of categories.
Yeah, so you could
actually build like a sort by multiple variables thing, which is more than most file managers have.
I would basically not resort, so take the list as it is now.
Yeah.
And then kind of regroup, preserving the relative order within each group.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes,
which is harder to not do that than to do that.
Yeah.
As long as you use
if you want notebooks sorted by name, you have to sort by name, then sort by notebook.
Yeah, and lots of things already work that way.
Yeah, no, that's sort of how
it just seems rather awkward to me, given that 95% of the time when you're on the dashboard, what you're going to want to open is a notebook. It seems strange that they're just thrown in with all the other files, including
well, but I don't. I mean, I think today you're right that 95% is opening notebooks.
Well, 100% is, or
directories.
100%.
But I mean, for use on your local computer, I don't think people are ever going to be using the IPython notebook as their primary text editor and image editor and audio player.
No, but I think it's going. Once we have the contents web service done and we add editing of code files, I think more and more people will use the notebook to do sort of more traditional software development, where they're going back and forth between modules and notebooks.
Putting code file editing in really so that if you're running it on a remote server, you don't have to open a separate connection to it to edit text files.
Yeah, I would be kind of surprised if local users really adopt CodeMirror, who love CodeMirror so much that they'd rather use CodeMirror to edit.
It's going to be a really terrible experience compared to whatever editor IDE people are using.
Yeah, it might be better than Vim or Emacs, but it would be terrible compared to a more modern editor.
I'm sure.
Thank you, Min. Yeah, I guess Paul is not here.
No, so I'm fine with doing the group by as the default view. That's fine.
Okay, so you then the other question is, right now every subclass of manager has to implement name-based sorting itself. Do we want to put that in?
I think the sorting belongs in the handler.
Entirely.
Yeah, because I think that's a view, right? That what you should get from the manager is os.lister. You know its contents are correct. You don't. The ordering is not part of the API.
Okay, then we should change that.
Yeah.
Okay, great. And then the other question is, do you think this pull request should have a corresponding contents manager JavaScript object, or do you think that's just a later? I mean, it's more significant refactoring on the JavaScript side. Presumably, both the dashboard and the notebook would use that object.
Yeah. Well, we need to. So it has since. For a couple of years now, it has been the plan to split the kind of API part of the notebook from the UI part.
Absolutely.
Model from the view. And because notebooks are just an ever so slightly special kind of file, once you do that, when we do that split of the notebook and the model,
right,
or of the view and the model, the model should just be a contents model. I'm not sure it needs anything special about the notebook. If it does, it should be a small subclass, because there's almost nothing special about notebooks in terms of the API.
Well, but I guess I had, after our discussions with Google, I had started to think about it in a slightly different way, and that is that there would be two objects that sort of map onto Google Drive file storage and Google Real-Time API. That there would be an in-memory model object that would, if it were enabled, would have things like the real-time collaboration stuff built in. But that's basically the true JavaScript model of the notebook. And then there's a separate object, which I had been thinking about as what contents is, and that basically takes care of persisting it to a file system.
Yeah, but that's the API. That's what I'm talking about. That's the thing that needs to be pulled out.
Yes.
From what we have right now.
Okay, great.
Because it's completely unrelated to what's on the page.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
But right now it's the same JavaScript. But that's a later thing. But
okay.
I do think that the contents, the fact that that's not even, most of that is, or almost none of that is notebook specific, that should be considered when doing that split. But I don't want to do that in SPR because that's a big it's a big change.
Okay. I'm hoping that I'll be able to finish the review of that by tomorrow. I've got some stuff going on today, but tomorrow afternoon I should be able to get on that again.
Yeah, and I guess just an update. I have a sketch of multi-user stuff. So I have a toy repo where there's a HTTP proxy in front, or there's a multi-user server. It spawns an HTTP proxy, and then when you hit it and log in as a user, it spawns a single user thing, and then configures the proxy to add another route to forward to the new single user thing.
Cool.
That whole thing.
This must have been what prompted your comment on Twitter about your love for JavaScript.
Yeah, writing Node is my new favorite thing. It's an awful, awful language with
Are you
awful
using
libraries.
bleeding edge harmony flag with the Yale statement of ES6 and everything, or just plain old callbacks?
No, just a bunch of callbacks.
Okay, yeah, that's fantastic. Let us know when that goes up and we can see.
Yeah, hopefully I'll have. I mean, I can push the toy thing. It's not very interesting, but at least I know how to configure, how to run and configure a proxy while it's running. Yeah, and I've got a partially written IPEP for the whole flow of it.
Okay. Yeah.
Close to when it's closer to complete.
Great. My next code review task, Thomas, will be all of your kernel stuff.
Thank you.
So I'll get on that and try to just keep up with you guys. And then Fernando got back into town last night at
like 2.
1 or 2 or something, yeah. And so I'm assuming he's sleeping, but he will probably reemerge someday now.
Yeah.
Before we go, the test emails are working again, so we will be notified of those of us who are subscribed to the IPython build list will be notified of test failures. So,
those of Thomas who are subscribed to the list will be notified.
Yeah, I control the admin interface, so I may just go and subscribe you all.
Yeah,
that's fine.
Okay.
All right.
Well, I think that's it. And see everyone next week. And
See ya.
bye-bye.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.